Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Graham. Welcome to our second lecture on foreign aid. And what we're going to be talking about today are kind of a few aspects of what I kind of view as the current frontier in foreign aid, sort of recent developments in aid, recent sort of creative ideas that are floating around out there to rethink aid. And when we meet together to talk about this, there's a few different things that I'm having you read. There's some material in this lecture, but I would also really like to draw out things that you all have run across that you think of as sort of new and interesting innovations or new ideas that are floating around with respect to how to do aid effectively, right? We walked through a lot of sort of pathologies of foreign aid in the last lecture and talked about the persistent difficulties in using foreign aid to generate economic growth in particular. Sort of discussed about that whether a debate between whether is it simply that the amounts of money we've been spending on foreign aid are much too small to impact something large like national level economic growth in more than 100 countries, or is it that the efforts themselves are misguided? Either they are the wrong types of aid, or maybe the whole effort, as Dan Moyle would argue, is misdirected itself. We've sort of done some of that kind of macro level thinking. This lecture is a bit more micro, talking about what some of the different kind of tweaks and innovations are that are floating around these days. So I think one of the key things that's transpired over the last, probably the last 20 years, but especially the last 10, is the revolution in measurement, where we're getting much better at measuring wealth in poor countries, right? Where we used to measure incomes, when we used to sort of think about measuring the wealth of individuals, we'd focus on incomes, on what people made. And particularly, we'd focus on the types of income records that we tend to have in rich industrialized countries, which are essentially the income tax rolls, right? And the payrolls that firms report to governments, right? And so this is all about formal sector wages, right? And formal sector wages make up a fairly small share of the economy in a lot of developing countries, where the gray market and sort of the informal economy are much larger, where many more people have part of their income coming from subsistence agriculture, informal trade, day labor, all these sorts of things that don't show up in that kind of income data. So there was an economist, Angus Deaton. He's the one who won the Nobel Prize for this, but quite a few, obviously, dozens of other people were involved in this. But you know, decided, he realized that in order to capture wealth in developing countries with large informal sectors, instead of focusing on income, you needed to focus on consumption. And so he pioneered data collection efforts via household surveys that focused on measuring consumption behavior. What are people buying? What are they eating? What do they own in terms of, do they own a refrigerator? Do they have a metal roof or a thatched roof? All these sorts of things that help you measure household wealth much more accurately than trying to get at payroll records from firms about the formal economy, which is going to miss a whole lot of what's going on in most households. So that's going on with household consumption, which is super helpful in understanding the distributional impacts of a lot of different economic policies, right? We talked about how different policies might have a positive effect on GDP, but might also be driving up inequality. Well, inequality is really hard to measure, right? It's very data intensive to measure because you need to know how much every single individual in a society is making. And it can be relatively easy to figure out what the richest people in society are making, right? They tend to have formal sector incomes. They tend to have assets held in banks, right? But if we want to understand what's going on in the lives of the economic lives of the poorest individuals in a country, we need much better data. And until very recently, we've generally lacked that data. Right? Okay. Well, at the same time, we've been getting better income on the household wealth of lower income individuals. We've also been getting much better data on education and how it's distributed, on health and how that's distributed, right? That we have these country level estimates of things like child mortality. But in terms of really understanding the health and well-being of a population, and how that health is distributed across different subsets of the population. The type of data that are becoming available now give us a lot more fine-grained insight than we used to have. And this is really important when if we have a moral or a normative concern with how wealth and well-being are distributed in a society, then we need sort of data that give us insight into how we're doing on that to actually evaluate what the effectiveness of different policies are, not just on like top line numbers about national level GDP or overall life expectancy, but how it's affecting the wealth, health, and well-being of different subgroups within society. Okay. So data, why is data so important in this context? And it's important because we tend to try hardest to improve what we can measure, right? And if you think about it sort of in a democratic governance context, voters are trying to hold politicians accountable for outcomes, right? One of the cleanest findings in predicting presidential elections in the United States is that when disposable incomes are going up and when unemployment is going down, those are very strong predictors of presidential reelection, right? So we are able to hold presidents accountable for the performance of the economy in this country. Um, and individuals don't have to estimate how well the economy is doing based on whether they have a job or whether their neighbors have a job. Like they can look at good data about the unemployment rate and disaggregate all the way down to the county level and to the zip code level and think about unemployment rates for different racial groups and different age groups and different geographic regions, right? We really can, as American voters, we have a lot of this kind of information, and now this kind of information is becoming available to voters in a lot of places around the world. That this real ability to hold politicians accountable to a wider variety of outcomes. Okay, when we're really focused on, for example, on economic growth, right? This is a top line number that politicians tend to get held accountable for, right? What's the growth rate of the economy? Um, this can be a little bit unhealthy because GDP is maybe not the thing we really need to be optimizing, right? There's a lot of critiques out there of GDP. So GDP is this attempt, it's gross domestic product, and it's this attempt to measure the sum total, the value of all the goods and services produced in an economy, right? And the problem is like, we kind of use that as a proxy for economic well-being of the country, which isn't crazy. Like it's certainly correlated with that. But there, for example, if you have a hurricane that knocks down all the houses and then you rebuild half of them, your GDP is going to be a lot larger than if none of those houses got knocked down in the first place, right? Or if, so GDP picks up economic activity in the formal sector. If you have a bunch of people providing elder care in the home, right, and the elderly folks are able to stay in the houses that they've been living in, they don't get displaced, they're living with family members, they're being cared for by extended family members, that's not going to show up in GDP. But if those people have to leave their homes and go into nursing homes and be in an institutional care context, all that is going to show up in GDP, right? All the salaries of the nursing home workers and all the payments to the nursing homes, right? That's all in GDP, right? And so that's going to be a larger GDP than a society where all of the elder care is being done kind of inside this extended family rubric. And so we might normatively value a situation where a policy environment that fosters the ability of families to provide care to aging parents in the home, that gives, for example, tax breaks to or subsidies even to people who stay home and leave the formal sector workforce in order to care for aging parents, right? So there are things that the government could do to incentivize and make financially possible that kind of in-home elder care. But that would actually drive down GDP. It might be normatively preferable, but it'd be associated with lower GDP. So if we're evaluating um, politician performance based on GDP, right, it's going to incentivize politicians to pursue policies that have a lot of people in nursing homes as opposed to a bunch of people cared for at home. To sort of provide one example, right, that when we are optimizing imperfect measures, we're going to optimize sort of imperfect outcomes potentially, right? So it's something we really want to attend to when we think about, well, what are we measuring, and what are we holding people accountable to? If we are better at measuring inequality, we might do more to fix it, right? And we're getting better and better at that. And inequality is entering into the public discourse, right? Much more, and so, and one of the big moments I think in the inequality debate was, and we'll talk about this in our inequality lecture, is sort of the release of this Piketty book a few years ago, on sort of historical, that introduced essentially a bunch of historical data in Western Europe on wealth inequality. And so we'd had data on income inequality for quite some time, in recent years. But this allowed us to get a much more historical look and to focus on wealth inequality, which is sort of, so the difference between income and wealth is that income is a flow, it's the amount of money you have coming in every year, and wealth is the total value of all the assets you own. And so, in many ways, sort of wealth inequality is a little bit more important with respect to the kind of things we think about in terms of uh, power and the way that sort of class is intergenerational, kind of the intergenerational inequality. That's mostly a wealth story more than an income story. But we talked a lot about income inequality because that's what we had data on. Piketty comes in with a bunch of these historical estimates on wealth inequality, really transforms the nature of that inequality conversation. And some of this was that book happened to arrive at a moment where we were already talking about inequality, and so that helped propel the book. But the book and the data in it also helped propel that inequality conversation and focus it on wealth and not just on income. So we tend to be able to talk about and able to address and able to prioritize the things that we can measure. It's not impossible to prioritize or talk about or focus on things we can't measure, but being able to measure things, having good data and good information on things, as human beings, it makes it easier to hold people accountable, to set goals for ourselves and that sort of thing. Okay. So in this vein, I want to talk about the doing business indicators, which are a set of indicators that are released by the World Bank every year. And they measure things. So the World Bank measures this in countries around the world. I think they have data on 150 countries or so in this last year. And it covers things like how many steps does it take to register a new business, right? How many steps does it take to get a building permit? How many steps does it take to pay your taxes? How long and expensive are each of those processes? How long and expensive is it to get a container of goods through customs on the way in if you're importing and on the way out if you're exporting? If you're a business and you receive a check from somebody and that check bounces, how long does it take you to collect on that bounced check, right? All these sorts of things, which is, so these are measures of, you call them sort of bureaucratic efficiency, and measures of how difficult it is to do business in a country. And so the World Bank is measuring these. What you measure is usually driven by and drives a set of priorities, right? So the World Bank chose these things to measure because the economists at the World Bank think that if it is easier to do business in a country, then you're going to get more economic growth. So there's a normative intention already put around decisions about which data to collect, right? And then that has really driven government behavior. When I was doing field work for my book and looking at foreign investment in both Georgia and in the Philippines, I spent time in both of those countries. When I was in Georgia, you occasionally, you stay in these hotels that sort of service business travelers, and CNN International is often one of the channels on the TV, and the Georgian government was running ads on CNN International at the time that were like these Sports Center themed ads that advertised all the progress that Georgia had made in the doing business indicators. The time I was there was not too long after they had sort of done a major kind of anti-corruption push that focused on the traffic police, among other sort of institutions that used to be pretty corrupt. But they'd also done a whole bunch of regulatory overhaul that was aimed very specifically at cutting down the number of steps to register a business, cutting down the number of steps to get a bill, making these, really teaching to the test, really engaging in reforms that were optimized to improve Georgia's ranking in the doing business indicators. And they did shoot up through the rankings, right? And they were very, very proud of this. And they were advertising that on CNN International, targeting potential foreign investors, right? Saying, come do business here. Look how much we've improved, right? And the same thing was true when I was in the Philippines. That I talked with a lot of folks in different kind of in the Ministry of Finance and in the folks that were tasked with recruiting foreign investment and doing that sort of thing. So I talked with a lot of these sorts of bureaucrats, and man, they knew exactly where they were ranked in the doing business indicators and what other countries in the region were slightly ahead of them or slightly behind them. And what, like this was something that was front and center in their minds as they went about their jobs and as they designed regulations and practices in how they were managing the Philippines economy. Um, and there's some, so then there's, so these doing business indicators became really powerful in terms of shaping government behavior around the world, right? And it started out as a set of indicators that just an academic economist started out collecting, and then, became sort of institutionalized within the World Bank, and then became a really, kind of became a very, very big deal. Um, so driving a lot of behavior, and then there were a lot of critiques of these data, right? Are they really measuring the right things? So there's critiques that this stuff was too, that what they were capturing was too narrow, that they were calling this sort of the ease of doing business index, and like this was what it meant to have a positive business climate. People were saying, well, no, a positive business climate is many more things than this. This isn't necessarily like a comprehensive set. And then but there's kind of an ideology baked into the set of things that the World Bank is measuring, and in some sense, there's an ideology baked into mainstream economics, right? And so you have all these PhD economists staffing the World Bank and staffing the IMF, right? And there is an ideology baked into it, and there's an ideology baked into those institutions that dates all the way back to Bretton Woods, right? Where these are institutions that were founded in the early days of the Cold War, and with a mission to not just so like with the World Bank, their mission is not just to alleviate global poverty; it's to alleviate global poverty and promote capitalism, right? Like it's a two-pronged mission, right? Because this is part of a Cold War agenda for the West, right? So it's about poverty alleviation, but very explicitly through capitalist means and not through socialist means. And so, one of the things that's baked into the understanding of what it means to have a good business environment is that a good business environment is one where firms are relatively unfettered in their behavior and don't face a lot of onerous regulations, right? Like this is there are some neoliberal sort of capitalist assumptions baked into these data, right? Into the decisions about what to collect and how to define a good business environment, right? It's one where firms are not particularly restricted by the government, right? This is a laissez-faire approach to what it means to manage the economy and what it means to manage the economy well. Um, so, the idea that you can improve your doing business rank by getting rid of just about any type of regulation, even regulations that are necessary to preserve clean air and preserve clean water or preserve worker health and well-being, right? If you get rid of those regulations, your business climate starts to be ranked by the World Bank as being a more positive one, even if it's a business climate that isn't serving your citizens as well as the climate you had before, right? So there's some critique and some pushback around how what we measure shapes what we view as positive and what we reward governments for, right? That voters reward governments for saying, hey, we improved our business climate, we're generating economic growth, right? And that may come at the cost of other things, right? So how we measure a good business environment, right? Well, that's based on beliefs about what our priorities should be vis-a-vis environment, worker safety, and and growth of GDP. And this set of doing business indicators is very organized around a laissez-faire approach to maximizing GDP, which may or may not be sort of a normatively positive thing for governments to prioritize, right? So what we measure really matters. All right. Another sort of key example, and one that allows us to talk about sort of an evolution in thinking about what we measure and the trade-offs associated are the Millennium Development Goals. And it's nice here because we'll talk about the Millennium Development Goals, which were introduced in 2000, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, which were introduced more recently, and kind of how we evolved from those two sets of goals and what they looked like. So the first set of goals, adopted 2000, they were targeted to be achieved by the end of 2015, and uh, the folks who designed the goals cheated a little bit by assigning, they would set goals like cutting extreme poverty by half, but they didn't choose 2000 as the starting line. They chose 1995 as the starting line so they could take credit for progress that had already been made in the 5 years before these goals were established. Okay, fine. But there were 8 goals, and they were pretty discrete in terms of fairly clear and clean and easy to measure the progress on, right? So that was very much the ideology shaping what makes an effective goal. It's one where you can know whether or not you succeeded. You can hold yourself accountable. You can hold national, voters can hold governments accountable, et cetera. So the 8 goals included cutting extreme poverty by half, achieving universal primary education, cutting infant mortality by 2/3, right? So it's stuff around health and around economic development, education, human capital, that sort of thing, right? And the period from sort of 95 to 2015 included a lot of progress, right, in these areas. Some of, much of which was not driven by anything the UN did or foreign aid, and a lot of this was actually driven by China, right? So if you look here, um, if you look, in this, you'll see that China's going from 60% of the population all the way down to less than 10% of the population by 2012. So that's driving a lot of what, and then if you look at sort of the drop in the world average, a whole lot of that drop in the world is driven by China in particular, right? If you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, they were already in pretty good shape at the start of this. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, right, okay, they improved over this time window, but not by a great deal, right? So sub-Saharan Africa shows not a ton of improvement. Most of that world improvement is coming from improvements in China, right? So that's extreme poverty, right? So this is, so China's economic growth really takes off in 1985, or and is running, north of 7% for just decade after decade, and that's driving down the number of people in extreme poverty in China, and that's driving a lot of the world improvement there, a lot of global improvement. If we look at primary school completion rates, right? So the goal is 100%. You'll see that we've got some data on China early on, which suggests over 100% completion. Anyway, but and then no data later. But I would not actually read much into that line. I would say, in other words, we don't have much data on China. That we just don't have good data on China in this particular data source. But yes, we've got improvement in these sorts of things, right? But not transformative in primary education. Under 5 mortality does see transformative improvement over this time period, right? Going from 180 deaths per 100,000, or I'm sorry, per 1,000 live births, right? So this is 1 in 5 kids almost dying before the age of 5, right? Going from almost 1 in 5 down to about 1 in 10. So 1 in 10 is horribly high, right? But it's half. We've cut it by 50%, which is really significant, right? So we see dramatic improvements in under 5 mortality. Maternal mortality, we see really good improvements in, right? Again, we're not quite hitting our goals here, but we're really seeing sharp improvements over this kind of 20-year window here. Improved access to clean water, improved access to sanitation, right? Which again, the sanitation stuff, it's not transformative changes, except in China. Right? We see a very strong trend for China. Solid improvement, but not steady improvement, but not the same kind of transformative improvement elsewhere, right? So these were all areas where it was pretty possible to measure what was going on. But it was also a relatively narrow set of things that were covered in those development goals, right? So we had some health, we had some education, right? And we had some poverty stuff. And those were kind of the things that we hit. But it wasn't as broad as it could be. And so then there was this big process to develop the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which would sort of pick up starting for goals sort of for 2015 forward, right? And so some of these were sort of continuations of the Millennium Development Goals, of saying, well, let's not just cut extreme poverty, let's eradicate it, right? And there's a set of goals around health and education and sanitation that look quite similar to the original Millennium Development Goals, but setting again, sort of higher targets for each of those things. Goals around gender equality, goals around climate change and health of the oceans, and some of these goals that got really pretty big and broad in general. One of the goals is to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, right? And so this is something that is normatively important, I think. But it's certainly something like, how do you measure? Like, I can measure whether I've cut child mortality by half, right? But I can't measure whether I've successfully promoted a just, peaceful, and inclusive society very well, right? That's a much harder. So we've sort of moved away from narrow, discrete, and measurable to like sort of broad and aspirational, right? And there's trade-offs there, because if you're just focusing on the narrow, discrete, and measurable, there's stuff you're leaving out, right? And things that may be very important to what it means to be developed, right? Or to have sustainable development, right? And so there's this trade-off between things that we can measure and be clear about, and things that are broad enough to capture all the things we care about normatively. And so there can be a tension there in how we go about setting goals that I just want to point you toward, and let you all kind of wrestle with what's the appropriate trade-off in different contexts between, and this is something that's, we're talking about it specifically in the international development context, but it's something you will have to wrestle. Many of you, most of you, will be among the leadership of different organizations at some point in your professional life, whether that's a private firm or a non-governmental organization or a think tank or a government agency, right? A law firm, a medical practice. You will be in the leadership of an organization, and that organization will be setting goals and trying to achieve them. And do you set narrow, specific, measurable goals where you can track your progress cleanly and reward folks who are contributing to that, and fire people who aren't hitting their marks, right? Do you go for sort of transparency, clarity, things you can really measure, assess, and hold people accountable to? Or are you concerned with making sure that your goals fully match the values and priorities of the organization, right? And that may sometimes require including things in your goals and objectives that you can't measure very well, right? And so there's likely to be a tension um, that you all will face in your leadership experience. So I want to point you all to this as something that's a lot broader than just sort of the economic development context, right? Okay. One of the last things I want to leave you with, so again, I'm going to be, when we meet all in person, I'm going to be soliciting the ideas that all of you have and the ideas that you all have run across of kind of new frontiers in foreign aid, new ideas about how to generate economic growth in developing countries, and how to generate improvements in human welfare, right, globally. And I want to talk a little bit about prizes I mean, they're not new. They've been around for a while, but I think kind of an increasingly common characteristic, or not characteristic, but tool in the kind of aid and development context. And actually, I think it was Prince William, it was one member of the British family, was just involved in the announcement of a bunch of prizes for what they're calling Earth shots, right? As a sort of a play on moonshots, but having to do with environmental, sort of saving the environment and addressing climate change. And these are sort of, I think each prize is worth about £1 million. So what is that? $1.5 million ballpark, somewhere in there. I should know my pound to dollar exchange rate. Off the top of my head, I really don't. But those prizes are for kind of new and creative ideas in sort of saving the global environment. X prizes tend to be a little bit more discrete in terms of objectives, right? So those are sort of prizes for new ideas, and potentially influential ideas. X prizes are often, they will set up they're essentially a bounty on tough problems. If you can provide a solution that meets these criteria, you win the prize. So the first person to do X or Y. So for example, the Ansari Prize was for a reusable spacecraft. And you had to launch it into orbit, and then you had to recover it and then launch it a second time, I think were the criteria. But a real clear set of things. This is, if you build a craft that does X, Y, and Z, you win the prize, right? And that was first awarded in 2004, or was awarded in 2004. There was a prize for adult literacy software. If you could develop a piece of software like an app that achieved certain benchmarks in terms of how effective it was in teaching adults to read, then you would win a prize, right? So essentially, you're setting criteria around what success means and saying the first person to do this gets a prize. And what it does is it incentivizes a firm or a set of individuals to invest money in research and development, in technological advancement, um, with an economic incentive at the end, right? And so the traditional economic incentive for a firm to engage in a bunch of R&D is, if I develop this thing, I can sell it in a market and I have some expectation about how much I can sell it for. The prize is sort of says, look, if you can develop this technology, we just pay you for having developed it, whether you can sell that technology or not, right? So that adult literacy software, there may not have to be a big market for it, right? It may be that adults who are not literate often don't have a huge ability to pay high prices for this kind of software. There may not be a huge market for it, um, or not enough of one to drive the kind of investment that the prize awarders would like to see. So by putting a prize around it, then it helps motivate firms to engage in that research and development effort, because if they succeed, there's the financial payoff, right? And firms understand that risk return payoff, and you get investments in areas where you might not otherwise. Um, so we often see these kind of X prizes around new types of technology, but we also, I'm a big fan of the Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in African Leadership. I think it's really kind of a novel and interesting prize. And so this was, Ibrahim was I believe, an African telecom magnate, so an African billionaire, who funded this, endowed this prize. And the committee that chooses to whom to award this prize is sort of a group of Nobel laureates and other sort of folks. So it's sort of this kind of prestigious panel of people who decide whether or not somebody has won it. And it does not have to be awarded every year, right? It can be, but it does not have to be. And it pays out to a democratically elected leader on the African continent who leaves office when his or her term is up. That's the first thing you have to do, is leave when your term is up and have demonstrated exceptional leadership, right? And so there's a panel of people who sort of decides whether anybody who has exited office in the last 5 years has met this criteria of exceptional leadership. And if you win the prize, you get an immediate $5 million payout and a $200,000 per year salary for the rest of your life, right? So the basic idea is that this substantially reduces the incentives for corruption, right? In order to secure yourself financially, if you become an African head of state, you can know that if you perform your job well and exit on schedule, you are financially set for life, right? And so there's not a financial incentive to necessarily to engage in corruption, or there's less of one. There still is one. You can do a lot better than 200,000 per year for life, right? But you certainly can live very comfortably for the rest of your life without engaging in corruption. So it's aimed at changing the personal incentives of individual leaders in a creative way. And I say a creative way, and I think an interesting way, because I don't, it's very hard to intervene from the outside in governance without messing with sovereignty, and not without, inherently, if you are trying to affect the behavior of a democratic government from outside, then you're undermining democracy, because the behavior of leaders in a democracy should be driven by the preferences of their citizens. That's what democratic accountability means. If the behavior of leaders in a democracy is being driven by the preferences of somebody outside their country, then inherently they're not being driven as much as they should be by the citizens in that country. So there's this tension with trying to improve the behavior of a democratically elected leader. The only people in normative terms, the only people in a democracy who should be shaping the behavior of the leader of a democratic country are the citizens of that country, right? The voters in that country. And I like this prize because it seems to thread the needle relatively well. And I'm sure there are critiques out there that I'm not aware of, but it seems to thread the needle of affecting the incentives of the leaders of democratically elected countries in ways that, at least to my eyes, don't seem to undermine the channel of accountability between voters and leader, right? So I think that's a really neat prize. So we can think about one of the things I'll ask you all in class is sort of, what do you think of X prize is relative to other ways to spend aid money. And if you were to endow an X prize, like what X prize would you want to endow? Like what is the thing we need to provide more financial incentive around? What's the behavior or what's the type of innovation that we need to further incentivize? And so that's where I'll leave you today. And again, really encouraging you to think about like what are the most creative ideas you've heard of recently in terms of foreign aid or ideas for motivating human behavior that that serves sort of the global public good. Um, and I look forward to discussing that with all of you.